Hello everybody, welcome to this event hosted through ExChange Wales at Cardiff University and partnered by the University of Bristol. It's great to see so many of you here. I'm Jo Francis, Publishing Manager at Core & Bath, the UK's leading membership organisation for professionals working in adoption, fostering and kinship care. I'm chairing this event today and I'm delighted to be talking with Victoria Sharley and Alyson Rees about the book they published with Core & Bath recently, Working with Children Who Have Experienced Neglect. Dr. Victoria Sharley is a senior lecturer in social work with children and families in the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol. Alyson Rees is a professor of social work in the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University and assistant director of CASCADE. Both are registered social workers with a range of practice experience, and as you'd expect, they have a strong professional interest in supporting children who have experienced neglect. So let's get started. Welcome, Victoria and Alyson. So what was the impetus for this book? What made you decide to write it?
I think if it's okay, I'll try and start with that one, Jo. Thank you for the introductions and the welcome. I think there's a lot which led both Alyson and I to this point, to kind of conceiving the idea of the possibility for this book. But I'll start with myself and then I'll sort of bring Alyson in. But for me, I'd been in practice for a number of years. I'd been in a range of different roles within the local authority and within the sort of independent and charity sector. All of my work as a practitioner had involved working with other agencies. You know, it's one of our sort of core mandates. I'd been in early help teams, I'd been in assessment, child protection. I've been seconded across agencies through the local authority to the third sector. And a lot of my casework and my practice experience, all of it involved aspects of children who had been neglected or had been, or who were experiencing neglect. And I started to think about some of the challenges which were regularly occurring for me. And it was across all of, neglect was across all of my cases and my colleagues' cases. And we knew that it was sort of a common form of maltreatment, but it wasn't reflected in perhaps how we responded in our practice. Neglect wasn't always the most common category for children to be receiving support for or to be registered on a plan for. And it made me start sort of thinking about, you know, what is it that, and why are more senior colleagues agreeing that it's a really difficult form of maltreatment, the most difficult form to evidence? So what are the challenges? Why is that the case? What was making it so tricky for us? And why were we constantly receiving referrals, maybe for other forms of maltreatment, like physical abuse or sexual abuse? And within the referral, there might be 6 months or 8 months or 12 months of concerns about neglect that we were just being made aware of. And that was incredibly frustrating. So that was sort of my own starting point. At that point, I had a fantastic opportunity where I was able to undertake a PhD research study at Cardiff University. So very pleased to be invited back here today, because it's almost like coming home and being here through ExChange Wales. But, you know, that study focused upon understanding neglect and how it was understood across children's services or social services and education and schools and school staff, and looking at what some of those challenges were. And that really gave me an opportunity to sort of like pause and think about what's going on in practice and what can we do to perhaps find some key messages to think about how we can sort of think forward and improve things. And I had met Alyson at Cardiff University and we'd been working together. And I think we both sort of got to the point where we thought, actually, we can both bring things from our experience and knowledge which complement one another. So that's sort of where we came together. But Alyson, do you want to come in there?
Yes, yes. So as you say, we met together and were working on another project together. But I also was in practice for 16 years previously in the probation service and also in the domestic violence unit. And neglect had been, very common across both of those. My experience in both of those organisations. I also did a PhD, albeit many years ago now, but looking at foster care and what works in foster care and what kind of strategies work for children. And since then, I've done lots of studies looking at interventions. I've looked at children in education, looked after children in education, fostering well-being, confidence in care, and I'm currently doing a project on step up, step down with foster care. So really, we sort of work quite a good match for each other. In terms of, I had quite a lot of experience of different types of interventions, I think, to bring to the book.
Gotcha. And so how is the book divided up and why might that be?
Yeah. So first of all, I think like when we were thinking about the book in terms of its kind of aim and purpose, we really wanted something that was going to be practical, something that people could use in practice. It could be like this sort of resource you have on your desk. It's accessible enough that you can just flip it open and look through it. You don't need to sit down and read it for the evening, or, it's something you can dip in and dip out of. And we really wanted it to be focused not just on social work practice, but, appropriate and relevant for any practitioners who are involved in safeguarding children in a number of different agencies, and including our social work students as well as other students from different professional backgrounds. So we hope that's what we've done. We hope that it's something that has lots of signposting in it as well as kind of helpful tips and advice. But the actual content of the book, I think, does a couple of things. So part of it is about drawing upon some of those key messages on child neglect and working across different agencies from my own recent PhD. But it's also about bringing together Alyson and I's knowledge and experience from practice and combining that with like a synthesis of existing literature and research in the field, but doing that in a really kind of plain language, accessible format. In terms of like how the book's structured, again, we sort of separated it into two halves, again, representing how we feel our knowledge kind of complements each other's knowledge. The first half is sort of my own focus. It talks about how we understand neglect, the legislative and policy context, the impact of neglect, assessment, and again, the kind of crucial question, how we can kind of focus upon working more effectively across interprofessional boundaries. And it really draws upon my own and other practitioners' experiences in that field of kind of early help safeguarding child protection practice. But the second half of the book kind of then moves forward to thinking and considering messages on guidance on how to work with children who are receiving support for recovering from the trauma of neglect or experiencing neglect, and them in situations where perhaps they are being cared for by friends or family members, foster carers, or perhaps they're actually in care, or they might have been adopted by individuals. So that's the weighting of the book. We hope to sort of take you through the journey. But Alyson, would you like to say a little bit more about the second half?
Yes, yeah. The second half really focuses on different approaches that social workers, foster carers can take when working with children, when also working with birth parents, and also with foster carers. So very much about the range of approaches that are out there and how important it is to work in a really sensitized way with children who've experienced neglect.
Yeah, I mean, having read the book myself, of course, it is intensely practical. There's a lot of great advice in there for people who are actually working in this field. So that really does come through.
Yeah, I was just going to add, Joe, there are lots of case studies in there, and we've been really helped by social workers and foster carers and psychotherapists who's given their advice as well, and they helped us with case studies.
So the book explores child neglect How common is this in children and looked after children in particular?
Yeah, it's a good question, Joe. I think if we look at statistics, and I'm not going to spend ages talking about, statistics and figures, but
Yeah.
if we think about, in the UK, we're looking at about almost or nearly half of all child protection registrations would be for neglect. So it's the most common in our kind of national context. In England, it's the most common category. In Wales, a number of years ago when I was doing my PhD, it also was the most common category, but in more recent years, it's now the second most common category. So we see a bit of a switch and a change in maybe the culture of practice and the focus of registrations and practice. I think the most common form of maltreatment is emotional abuse or psychological abuse. So we're seeing some changes there. But if we're looking at a national level, this really is an issue which should be and is in the forefront of all of our minds as practitioners, whatever organisation or employer we're sat within. When we're safeguarding children, this is something that really should be at the forefront of all of our minds. Outside of kind of the statutory interventions, thinking about, how many children are impacted by neglect. Again, that's really hard to accurately reflect. It can often be a hidden issue. Children might not want to disclose, or they might be worried about sharing that information and the implications of actually doing that. There's also a lot of work that is being done by other academics around, the different definitions of how children define neglect themselves, which is different to how us as professionals or adults might see it. So there's a bit of a divergence there in terms of, what are we looking for and what do we know? Broadly, we think that, 1 in 10 children are likely to be impacted. So it's incredibly common. Yes.
And it can be easy to think we know what neglect is, that we would recognize it if we saw it. But speaking as somebody who isn't in social work, your book has definitely taught me otherwise. So what are we actually talking about when we say neglect? And I know now that this is more complicated than it might seem.
Yeah, it seems a strange thing. We're not wanting to overcomplicate it, but actually it's really important, I think, when you start to pause and reflect upon how we're conceptualizing it and how we're defining it, it does get really complicated, actually. I think when we hear the term, and certainly when I first went into practice, we just think we know what neglect is. I can say I did. I thought that we all had shared understandings. When we use that term, everyone in that team knew what we're talking about, or everyone, focusing upon supporting a child knew what neglect was. But I think when we stop and we reflect, we start to think, what is it for us? Is it a dirty home? Is it inadequate clothing for a climate? Is it a smell in the house? Is it clutter? Is it visible tide marks on a child's neck, or is it dirtiness? And we start to think about all the different things that it could be, and how each of us can see neglect from a very different perspective, depending on what we have the opportunity to see or visit, or who we can hear from. What's really interesting is that my own PhD really focused upon looking at those different interprofessional definitions and understandings of neglect. And one of the key messages from that project was, it's so diverse. There's such significant difference in how all of us understand it, not just across organizational boundaries or professional backgrounds from our training or from our experiences, but it's actually also connected to our own experiences in terms of us as individuals. So the lenses we look through, how we were parented ourselves, maybe our class, maybe our ethnicity, maybe our cultural norms, maybe how we decide to parent the children in our family. Maybe it's actually connected to culture within a team or outside of a team, and some of those social norms that we've shared. But all of these things, all of these ideas around the sort of social construction of neglect as a concept.
Yeah.
I think the important thing is to kind of start by saying, well, this is a concept that can change over time. It can shift and it can move, and it's really dependent upon the time and the values of people, the communities that you're supporting. And I think what, an example that we have seen over the years in practice is things like nutritional neglect used to be really defined as lack of nutrition, lack of appropriate kind of nutritional care, lack of food, children, not thriving, this idea that it's really impacting them. And what we're seeing in sort of more recent years is children being placed on child protection plans or on the register for worries of obesity, and parents or carers being held accountable for very different reasons, but for sort of nutritional neglect. So we see this shift a lot. But I think what the book does is it starts to really unpick some of these ideas. So it offers sort of a space to say, we perhaps don't give ourselves, or we don't have enough time in practice to think about some of these ideas. But let's, start to think about why it is so conceptually complex. And it's sort of tied to this idea that Jan Horwath talks about, this idea of, what's good enough care? How do we know, and how do we agree upon that as a group, no matter where we sit? And, what does good enough mean?
Yeah, there is a lot more to it than you might initially think, isn't there? So from what you've said, I can see neglect. It's hard to identify and it's hard to evidence for social workers. And I know you talk to social workers and other professionals when you were writing the book. Are there any particular difficulties they've had around this issue?
Yeah, that's right. So first of all, I'll always say this, it's not just social workers, it is social workers, but it's all practitioners as well. So I talked, a little bit already. I gave a nod to kind of some of those challenges across different agencies and also some of the findings from my study. But one of those findings really was about the divergence of definitions within social work teams. So depending on, who received a referral in the same team, a different response might be received to a very similar situation, and some of the sort of frustrations that can cause when working across different agencies. But evidencing it, so identifying it is one challenge, what we're seeing, how we articulate it, what we're hearing in terms of the articulation. Are we hearing the message as it's intended to us? What are we doing in terms of making meaning? But the other part, you're right, is about, evidencing it. That's also another challenge for practice. That was one of my own, very much my own challenges when I was in practice. How do we evidence and demonstrate that this is becoming problematic or impacting the child or the children's needs in that family? So it's thinking about, how do you start to evidence the omission of something? If it's an incident of physical abuse or sexual abuse, it's like an act of commission. You've got something tangible. You can demonstrate something happened at a specific time. Neglect is a little different. You might have a one-off incident that has occurred, but typically it's a range of different things from a range of causes. So it's thinking about, how do we start tangibly evidencing the lack or absence of care or parenting, or things which are becoming problematic? So I think that's what this book starts to do. It starts to sort of give ideas and suggestions for thinking about in practice how we can start monitoring and charting a progress or a decline in the quality of care in the family, and start to think about the use of chronologies, which I think we all hear as something is like quite a typical tool that we can use, but yet literature and research commonly talks about how we're not doing that as well as we could. And I think there are two parts to chronologies. One is the process of completing them. That's a challenge to do it across agencies. But the other part is they need to be analysed regularly and reviewed to identify patterns, to sort of monitor, what's happening for the family. And they can be really useful for opening up conversations to talk with families about how things have moved or shifted or changed. I think that's great. But in terms of the book, I go off because I start talking about neglect and I find myself somewhere else. But you asked me, you know, particularly about, you know, how we had contact with practitioners and social workers. As Alyson already mentioned, that was really important for us. We wanted to sort of demonstrate a breadth of experiences and knowledge. We talked to managers, carers, practitioners, students, sort of a whole range of people. And we've included their voices in the book. We drew upon them in developing sort of real life case studies or vignettes where they talk about their experiences, what went wrong, what went right, what they want to share as kind of like key insights for practice. And that's something I think both of us really like about this. It's a real collaboration of voices in the book. And the other thing we've done is we've also included sort of a list of resources that you can be signposted to. So if you want more depth, if you want more research, there are other things you can go away and look up if you have your time.
Yeah, fantastic. So looked after children, they may have been neglected in their early lives, and now maybe they're in foster care or kinship care, or even they've been adopted. So how might this early neglect affect them later on when they're in a new family?
Okay, I think that's probably my area, isn't it, really, to respond to? Yeah. I think it's most important really to remember that each child is an individual, and we can't know how each child is going to respond or has been impacted by neglect. And the most important thing is to talk to children, learn about them, spend time with them, and find out about their situation. But they might be lacking trust in adults. They will have experienced a lack of consistency of care, and they might feel that they can't rely on adults, and therefore they might want to have more control in their own lives and try and impose that control in their lives. They might feel unloved and unlovable, and they might have difficulty with relationships, with friendships in particular. School can be a challenge. They may not have attended regularly, and perhaps they can't develop friendships because they don't feel confident that they can invite people to come home because of the sort of home conditions. They might be embarrassed about them. Also about how they physically present in terms of their clothing and opportunities, you know, for cleanliness. So there will be lots of difficulties and self-consciousness that children might be experiencing, and in a new family they need to start to learn to trust and build those relationships again, and learn how to develop networks of friendships. And the Bright Spots research that's been done really highlights the importance of friendships for children who've experienced neglect. And we need to think about how can we as carers or as social workers help children to develop their friendship network. Some children may have some developmental delay and have not met, you know, the expected milestones. Yeah, in particular. And I think the most important thing really is just to get to know the child, listen to the child, and find out what's happening for them, and then tailor an approach accordingly. I don't think there's just an approach for working with children with neglect. It's about which type of approach would be best for this individual child.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned education there briefly, and you do say in your book that multi-agency working is really key when we're talking about neglect. So social work, health and education, for instance. But we know that this can be hard to do. What do you think is going wrong with multi-agency work here?
Yeah, I mean, that's the magic question. I think that's a big question, Joe, and I'm not sure I can answer it, but I have a go at some of the bubbling issues that I see. This is a real area of interest for me, and in terms of its importance for working with children who've experienced neglect, Alyson and I felt it was so important. We've devoted a whole chapter in the book to this. So there's lots of information there. But I think many people, you know, in literature, in practice, acknowledge that working across organisational boundaries when working in the context of neglect is really just the biggest challenge for neglect practice. You know, that I think that's beyond dispute, but it's, you know, and I think it's because, you know, we talk about when we even work individually or in our teams, we've started to talk about some of the complexities of how neglect as a concept is conceptualized and defined. When you then take that and put that within a much more complex system of organizations and how they work together. So if you think about just systems theory and how that sits, you know, within such, you're adding even more layers of lenses, you know, lenses or layers on top of each other. So you're then starting to consider different professional backgrounds, different opportunities for training, neglect-specific training, the absence of or a lot of. You start thinking about organizational relationships and roles and remits and how that can impact even sharing of information. On top of that, you can think about individual relationships. So, you know, you work with people, you don't get on with everyone. Some people might be very communicative in practice, which is great. Other people might be more hard to get hold of, or you might have, you know, had a bad meeting with them last month and things are a bit tense. You might have had a difference of opinion. But even aside from all those things, you're trying to work with this, the complexity of the concept of neglect, and you're doing so, and everyone has such busy workloads and they're being pulled in different directions. So just trying to work in a multi-agency context, I think, is challenging, but the two together is incredibly difficult. The kind of the way I like to think about this, and other academics or practitioners have talked about it, I can't claim this to be my own metaphor, but some people talk about, you know, the jigsaw of neglect practice, everyone having a little piece of information, and what's so important is how we bring this jigsaw together to make the whole picture. There's this idea also about this elephant of collaboration, I think it's called, and it's thinking about, you know, as professionals, we all sit looking at an elephant from all different positions. If we were to describe it, one of you might be thinking about the toes or the leg, and it's fat and it's hard, and someone else might be looking at the sort of floppy thin ear or the eye. And until you all describe it, you're all talking about the same child or the same child's experience, but you do need to somehow work together to share and articulate the information you have, to come together to sort of have a shared understanding. So I think that's part of the problem. There's lots we can do about it, and this book really offers some kind of suggestions or guidance in terms of areas we can work in to start to try and perhaps improve our practice.
Yeah, so this jigsaw that we've got going on, what would you suggest social workers and all those other professionals out there, what can they do to try and improve that? Is there any particular good practice that you'd share?
Well, in particular, I just really wanted to add the comment that quite often foster carers aren't involved in that multi-agency working, multidisciplinary working, and they're quite often left outside the team around the child. And the research that I've done tells me that they feel quite undervalued, and actually they're the people who are spending 24/7, you know, often with children and know most about them, but actually their views aren't listened to. So I think there's a big piece there for bringing foster carers into the team and respecting their opinions and their expertise. And I have done reviews of child practice reviews in Wales, and always sharing of information is one of the major findings in all child practice reviews, but also not listening to members of family, not listening to carers in particular, also comes out in, you know, those tragedies. So I think that's a really important factor. But one particular good approach is the fostering wellbeing approach, where social workers, health, education and foster carers are all trained together, and they begin to get to know each other. They work in small groups and build trust, and that's been really helpful, and that's been piloted and is now running across Wales. And foster carers have really talked about feeling much more in control, much more listened to and much more valued, which is also important. We want to retain foster carers. Also at Cardiff University, we train social work students along with health visiting students at the same time when we're doing neglect. So there is some, good practice in terms of multidisciplinary approaches. I'm just also sharing chronologies, as Vicky mentioned earlier, again in the child practice reviews that we've looked at. We've recommended that chronologies should be used a lot more, although, as Vicky said, there are different ways of using them and different depths. Reflective supervision, really, really important for practitioners. I think to stop and stand back and think, actually, you can become quite desensitized if you're working with child neglect very regularly. And maybe, you have to think, well, what standards would be acceptable for my own children as a corporate parent, and not become desensitized to the experiences of children in the community in which you're working. And lastly, potential, I think, for visual representation. Vicky, I think we talked a little bit about this recently, didn't we? I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, it sort of chimes with what you've said, Alyson, about, the importance, I think, for me, is about spaces for reflection, and that they could be a whole range of different spaces. Could be in supervision, it could be peer supervision, it could be a community of practice across different organisations focused on neglect. But spaces and opportunities where we can unpick what we are seeing visually with how we're articulating, what neglect is, and how that connects with perhaps the thresholds in our own organisation. And some practitioners have found it useful. They told us this in terms of our kind of engagement with the book, about using visual resources, so photographs of home settings or images or setups, to actually start to look at the same image or information and then interrogate what they would see themselves and how they would see that that's connected to some of the thresholds for intervention. So it's really starting to unpick that what is good enough care to each of us, and how are we articulating that at an agency level.
Oh, there's a lot there to think about. Going on to a slightly different subject now, this was something that caught my eye. Your book has a chapter on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and I'm sure many listeners are familiar with those. And I know the ACEs perspective is quite popular these days, but you argue in the book that we do need to be cautious about ACEs. Could you say more?
Yeah, I think my worry about them is that they can be a little bit deterministic, and we can assume that because a child has had adverse experiences, they're going to naturally struggle later in life, and they're not going to do as well. And I think that can lead us to have less aspirations and expectations for children, which isn't helpful as they grow older. The theory also suggests that people make poorer choices in adulthood if they've had previous experiences. But the reality is that a lot of it is not about choices, it's about social capital, it's about poverty, it's about a range of other things. So I'd want to be cautious in that way. Also, the science on ACEs, I think, is quite clunky. It's just a list of items. None of them are weighted. None of them are weighted. So, for example, having a parent in prison, which is another area that I do research into, you know, is one of those factors. But it would very much depend on, you know, which parent it was, whether it was a mother or father, whether you had to move home, you know, lots of different things. And none of those are weighted. So I think it's a little bit simplistic, and I just a little bit of caution, I think, in terms of our approach to ACEs. Yeah, so, you know, having those poorer life experiences doesn't mean that children can't go on to live very productive, be very loving adults. We don't need to assume that there's always an intergenerational impact.
No, definitely. It's definitely that's something that's always struck me with ACEs, the fact that there is no weighting there. It's just something that they're all the same. And of course, we know life's not like that. So
domestic abuse is this, you know, same sort of thing. It depends on the severity of it, the length of time that you'd witnessed or experienced it.
Okay, well, your book has a lot of information about different approaches to use when working with children who've been neglected, such as therapeutic parenting. And I'm sure this part of the book would be very useful for social workers, parents, and foster carers, for instance. So obviously we don't want to give everything away that's in the book, but what are a few approaches that really seem to make a difference to children when there's neglect in the past?
Yeah, I think the first thing is taking a really individual approach and listening to the child, because what the child hasn't had in the past is often that individualized, caring, nurturing experience. So we really need to listen to them and find out how they feel they've been impacted, but also really important to find out what they're interested in. What are their capabilities and what are their skills, and to take a strengths-based approach. It's really important that we develop resilience. It's something that I really believe in as being really important. And then once we've sort of understood an interest, then trying to ensure that the child has the opportunities to develop that, harness that interest, and so that they can see that they can achieve things, whether it be in music or in art or whatever it is, and it helps build confidence. And I couldn't help but I've watched The Piano just recently. I don't know if other people have watched it. And Brad Keller had been in foster care and had expressed an interest in the piano, and his foster carers brought him a keyboard, and there he was. He won the award without any social capital, no music lessons or anything. So, you know, really channeling children's interest is important. But there are a lot of strategies I talk about. I mean, about pace, about a very sensitized way of working with children, being playful, having acceptance, being curious, asking questions, finding out, and also having a great deal of empathy. But one I really like, and I have done a couple of research projects on, is video interactive guidance.
Yes.
Working with birth parents, but also with foster carers, to develop an attunement and a sensitivity to children, because quite often that's not what they've experienced in the past. So particularly relevant for child neglect. And if you're interested in video interactive guidance, there is a whole section on it and a link to lots of resources and a case study from Cornwall where we've done research in the past. So yeah, but overall it's about being highly sensitized to the needs of the child.
Wow, well, that's a wealth of information there. Let's maybe bring this to a close now. Have you got any final message for social workers or other professionals when it comes to this subject?
We've already touched upon it, and I know because we talk about this a lot, Alyson and I, spaces and places for that reflective supervision. So not to keep going over that, but that would be kind of my first answer to your question, Joe. I think that aside, we've got some really useful simple activities in the book, which starts you to kind of just ground yourself in your own pre-assumptions and things about neglect, and some questions that you could do with a colleague or you could do in supervision to start to unpick why you think some of the things you think. So I would say that's really important, just stopping and starting to unpeel as a sort of the first point. But for me, like, those two things aside, because we've talked a lot about those two topics, I think what's really important is not underestimating kind of the amount of effort for all practitioners, and, you know, social workers as the sort of leads, but all practitioners in accessing and gathering and obtaining information about a child or children to inform judgments about then how you best support them in a timely way that suits their needs. And I think naturally, certainly myself in practice, we do these tasks, but I think there's lots to sort of reflect upon in terms of, you know, the challenge of accessing information from a range of different sources. And when we get that information, is it easily transferable, as in what it says? Can we just take that information, or does it need some sort of translation? I think that's what would be important for me. And I think for me, the answer is probably in most cases, yes. We get some information, we think that's easy to understand and we can make sense of it. But actually, from a very different professional perspective, with a different role and agency remit, different training, different focus, actually, we need to look at that information and interrogate it in terms of how it informs the decisions we make about supporting children who've experienced neglect.
And I think from me, it's not to be desensitized to levels of neglect, because it's very easy to get used to it and accept it. But also to think about working in a strengths-based way with children, building their resilience, building their social capital, and to know that they will go on to live productive, happy, settled, and loving lives. So, you know, and we have the same aspirations that we have for our own children.
Oh, I think that's a lovely thought to finish the discussion on there. Wow. That really has been a wealth of information. Thank you very much, guys. And of course, remember, listeners out there, there's a lot more in the book. So this is your chance. Any questions? It may well be that Vicky and Alyson have answered all your questions already. Don't think we've got anything coming in there. So I think you've done a good job there. Thank you very much. In which case, no question. Oh, no, there we go. That's more about the book just popping up there. In which case, I think maybe we will bring that to a close. I think you've answered everyone's thoughts. So Victoria and Alyson, thank you for a fascinating discussion. And I hope this has inspired many people out there listening to visit the Cor and Bath website and buy the book, and also just to find out more about neglect and think more about this subject. Don't forget your discount code in the chat. That's available for the next fortnight. And on the website where the book is for sale, you'll also find a free taster chapter, which you can access to have a read to find out if the book is for you. There's also a short podcast on there with Alyson and Victoria. So thanks again to everyone for attending, and to ExChange Wales, Cardiff University and the University of Bristol for organising and supporting this event. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice afternoon.